The midnight alarm shattered the peace of Kodiak Survival Institute like breaking glass. Sarah Chen's eyes snapped open in her cramped bunk, her heart racing as the blood-red emergency lights bathed the barracks in hellish crimson. Around her, 47 elite military personnel scrambled from their beds, cursing and grabbing gear in the chaos of an unexpected drill. "Move! Move! Move!" Chief Instructor Kane's voice boomed through the speakers. "Full gear! Rally point Alpha in 60 seconds." Anyone who's late gets to explain why they're not cut out for this program. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah rolled out of her thin mattress, her movements economical and precise despite the pandemonium. While Navy SEALs crashed into each other in their haste, while Green Berets barked orders and Delta Force operators checked their weapons with military efficiency, she simply dressed. No fanfare, no cursing, no dramatic displays of readiness. Just a small woman in oversized fatigues, pulling on worn combat boots that had seen better decades. She was invisible in the chaos, which was exactly how she preferred it. The Alaskan wilderness stretched endlessly beyond the compound's gates, a frozen wasteland where temperatures dropped to 40 below and the sun barely kissed the horizon for 3 months of the year. This was Kodiak Survival Institute, the military's most brutal training ground, where only the elite of the elite came to learn how to survive the impossible. Sarah Chen didn't belong here. Everyone knew it. She knew it. The question was why she kept pretending otherwise. The wind howled across the frozen tundra as the trainees assembled at Rally Point Alpha, their breath forming clouds in the -30 air. Sarah stood at the back of the formation, her slight frame almost comical next to the towering figures of America's finest warriors. At 5'3" and maybe 110 pounds soaking wet, she looked like someone's kid sister who'd wandered into the wrong summer camp. Chief Instructor Kane emerged from the darkness like a nightmare given form. 6'4" of pure muscle and scar tissue, he'd survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and a classified mission in Syria that had left him with a permanent limp and eyes that had seen too much. His reputation preceded him like a storm front. In 15 years of running Kodiak, he'd never had a single trainee complete the program who didn't have at least 10 years of elite military experience. "Listen up, warriors," Kane's voice cut through the Arctic wind. "We've got ourselves a special situation tonight. Weather Service says we're looking at a Category 5 storm system moving in from the Bering Sea. Winds up to 120 miles per hour, temperatures dropping to -50 with the wind chill. In other words, perfect training conditions." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the formation. These were men who'd jumped out of planes into hostile territory, who'd breached terrorist compounds under fire, who'd survived the worst humanity could throw at them. But Mother Nature was a different kind of enemy entirely. Kane's eyes swept the formation, pausing momentarily on Sarah before moving on with barely concealed disdain. "Your mission is simple. Survive the next 72 hours with minimal gear, no shelter, no food, no communication devices. Just you, your wits, and whatever you can scavenge from the environment. The weak will be eliminated. The unprepared will be eliminated. And anyone who thinks this is some kind of game will be eliminated permanently." Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, the ranking SEAL officer in the group, stepped forward slightly. At 32, he was a legend in the teams, having led successful operations in 4 different theaters of war. His chest bore the scars of shrapnel from an IED blast in Fallujah, and his left arm carried the faded ink of a tattoo commemorating fallen brothers. When Morrison spoke, even seasoned operators listened. "Chief, what about the civilian?" Morrison's voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of life and death leadership. No disrespect, but this storm system could kill experienced personnel. She's got no business being out there." Kane's expression darkened. "Ms. Chen volunteered for this program, Lieutenant Commander. She signed the same waivers, took the same oath, and paid the same price of admission as everyone else. If she can't handle the heat, she's welcome to ring out any time." Sergeant Major Rodriguez, a Green Beret with 22 years of service and more combat deployments than he could count, shook his head. "Chief, with respect, we're talking about survival, in conditions that would challenge a polar bear. She weighs maybe 100 pounds. The cold alone will kill her in hours." "That's assuming she lasts that long," added Captain Brooks, Delta Force, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who'd seen what happened when people overestimated their capabilities in hostile environments. "Body mass ratio, cold weather experience, physical conditioning. She's got none of the prerequisites for this kind of operation." The other trainees nodded in agreement. These weren't cruel men, but they were realistic ones. They'd seen good soldiers die because someone had put them in situations they weren't prepared for. Sarah Chen, with her civilian background and obvious lack of military bearing, represented exactly the kind of liability that got people killed. Kane listened to their concerns with the patience of someone who'd heard it all before. "Your objections are noted and logged. Miss Chen, you've heard the assessment of your peers. Last chance to withdraw with your dignity intact." Sarah stepped forward, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I'm staying, Chief." Morrison tried one more time. "Ma'am, this isn't about pride or proving a point. This is about survival. These conditions will test every skill we've developed over decades of training. What's your military background?" "I don't have one," Sarah replied simply. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if nature itself was shocked by the audacity of her response. "No military background," Brooks repeated, his voice rising. "No special forces training, no survival schools. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "No combat experience?" "None," Sarah confirmed. Rodriguez stepped closer, his voice taking on the tone of someone speaking to a child. "Ma'am, I've got 12 years of survival training. I've eaten bugs in the Amazon, melted snow for water in Afghanistan, and built shelters in conditions that would make an Eskimo cry. These boys," he gestured to the SEALs, "they've survived hell itself. And we're all worried about making it through the next 3 days. What makes you think you can do what we might not be able to do?" Sarah's answer was so quiet they had to strain to hear it. "I guess we'll find out." The laughter started with Morrison, a short bark of disbelief. It spread through the formation like wildfire, seasoned warriors shaking their heads at the absurdity of the situation. Here was a woman with no training, no experience, no physical advantages, calmly announcing her intention to outlast Navy SEALs in Arctic survival conditions. "This is insane," muttered Staff Sergeant Williams, Force Reconnaissance Marine. "She's going to die out there, and we're going to have to live with watching it happen." Kane raised his hand for silence. "Gear distribution in 5 minutes. You'll receive 1 knife, 1 fire starter, 1 emergency blanket, and 1 water purification tablet. Everything else, you improvise. Extraction point is marked on your maps. 15 miles north through the worst terrain Alaska has to offer. Storm hits in 2 hours. I suggest you use that time wisely." As the trainees dispersed to collect their minimal gear, Sarah found herself surrounded by a small group of concerned operators. Morrison took the lead, his voice gentle but firm. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to prove, but this isn't the place to do it. These conditions will kill you. Not might kill you, will kill you. Is whatever point you're making worth dying for?" Sarah looked up at him, her dark eyes unreadable in the red emergency lighting. "Lieutenant Commander, I appreciate your concern, but I've come too far to quit now." "Too far?" Rodriguez interjected. "Lady, you just admitted you have zero relevant experience. How far could you have possibly come?" "Further than you might think, Sergeant Major." Captain Brooks stepped forward, his patience wearing thin. "This is ridiculous. Chief Kane, you're seriously going to let her commit suicide on your watch? Because that's what this is. Suicide by exposure." Kane's response was cold and final. "Ms. Chen is a legal adult who signed all the necessary waivers. She's been briefed on the risks. If she wants to Darwin herself out of the gene pool, that's her choice. But I'll be damned if I'm going to baby anyone in my program." The gear. Distribution was a somber affair. Each trainee received their meager supplies and studied the topographical maps showing the route to the extraction point. 15 miles didn't sound like much until you factored in the terrain: ravines, frozen streams, dense forest, and elevation changes that would challenge even experienced mountaineers. Add in the approaching storm system, and the mission became a genuine test of survival skills. Sarah accepted her gear without comment, checking the knife's edge, testing the fire starter, and examining the emergency blanket with the methodical attention of someone who understood that details mattered. The other trainees watched her with a mixture of fascination and dread, like witnesses to an impending disaster. "She's going to be dead within 6 hours," Morrison confided to his SEAL teammates. "Hypothermia, exposure, or she'll fall into a ravine and break her neck. Either way, we're going to have to carry her body out of there." "Assuming we can find it," replied Petty Officer Jackson, a sniper with an eye for detail and a reputation for pessimism. "This storm's going to create whiteout conditions. If she gets separated from the group, she's gone forever." The wind was already picking up, carrying with it the promise of the hell that was coming. In the distance, lightning flickered against the clouds, an ominous preview of the electrical storm that would accompany the blizzard. This was Alaska at its most dangerous, a place where nature didn't just challenge you, it tried to kill you with methodical efficiency. As the trainees prepared to move out, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of trying to stay close to the group for protection, she began walking toward the tree line alone. Not running, not hurrying, just walking with the steady pace of someone who had somewhere to be. "Hey!" Brooks called after her. "Where do you think you're going?" Sarah paused, turning back with a slight smile. "To survive, Captain. Same as you." And with that, she disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a group of elite warriors who suddenly found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about survival, about strength, and about the quiet woman who'd just walked into a death trap with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The storm hit with the fury of a living thing, transforming the Alaskan wilderness into a frozen hell where visibility dropped to zero and the wind howled like the voices of the damned. Within an hour, the temperature plummeted to -40, and the wind chill made it feel like walking on the surface of an alien planet. The Navy SEALs had grouped together, using their combined body heat and experience to construct a shelter from fallen branches and their emergency blankets. They'd found a natural windbreak in a cluster of pine trees and were working systematically to create a survival camp that would keep them alive through the worst of the storm. "Anyone got eyes on the civilian?" Morrison asked, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. Jackson, who'd been monitoring their back trail, shook his head. "Lost her thermal signature about an hour ago. She's either dead or..." He paused, not wanting to voice the alternative. "Or what?" pressed Morrison. "Or she found better shelter than we did." The SEALs exchanged glances. Better shelter was a relative term in conditions like these. There was no such thing as comfortable in -40 weather, only degrees of miserable. For someone with Sarah's apparent lack of experience to find adequate shelter in this terrain seemed impossible. "She's probably hypothermic by now," said Petty Officer Davis, the team's medic. Confusion, loss of coordination, poor decision-making. She could be wandering in circles, thinking she's heading for the extraction point when she's actually walking deeper into the wilderness. 2 miles away, the Green Berets were dealing with their own challenges. Sergeant Major Rodriguez had led his team to a natural cave formation, but the shelter came with its own problems. The cave provided protection from the wind, but it was also a natural refrigerator, trapping cold air and making it difficult to maintain body temperature. "This is bullshit," muttered Sergeant Peterson, one of Rodriguez's most experienced operators. "We're burning through our energy reserves just trying to stay warm. At this rate, we'll be too weak to make the extraction point even if we survive the storm." Rodriguez was thinking the same thing. Survival wasn't just about lasting through the immediate crisis. It was about conservation of energy, strategic thinking, and maintaining the strength needed for the long haul. They were trained for this, equipped for this, and they were still struggling. The thought of Sarah Chen out there somewhere, alone and unprepared, weighed on his mind like a stone. "Should we try to find her?" asked Specialist Martinez, the youngest member of the team. "If she's still alive, she might need help." "In these conditions?" Rodriguez shook his head. "We'd be more likely to get lost ourselves. Best thing we can do is survive the night and hope we find her body tomorrow." The Delta Force operators had taken a different approach entirely. Captain Brooks had led his team to higher ground, gambling that elevation would provide better visibility and navigation advantages once the storm passed. It was a calculated risk that required them to endure more wind exposure in exchange for tactical positioning. "This is fucking insane," growled Master Sergeant Cole, a veteran of so many classified operations that his service record was more black ink than readable text. "We're conducting a survival exercise that's turned into a body recovery mission. That woman is dead, and we're going to have to explain to her family why we let her commit suicide." Brooks didn't respond immediately. He was studying the storm patterns, trying to predict when the worst of it would pass. In his 15 years of special operations, he'd learned to read weather like a book, and this storm was writing a story of unprecedented fury. "She made her choice," he finally said. "We warned her. Kane warned her. Hell, Mother Nature warned her. Some people just don't listen." But even as he said it, Brooks felt the uncomfortable weight of responsibility. They were warriors, protectors, and they'd let a civilian walk into certain death. The fact that she'd insisted on it didn't make it any easier to accept. The storm raged through the night, a relentless assault of wind, snow, and cold that tested every survival skill the trainees had ever learned. Trees bent and snapped under the force of the wind. The snow fell so heavily that it created drifts 6 feet deep in a matter of hours. The temperature continued to drop, reaching levels that could kill an exposed human being in minutes. And somewhere in that frozen wasteland, Sarah Chen was experiencing it all alone. Dawn came like a reluctant witness, painting the devastated landscape in shades of gray and white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed world where familiar landmarks had disappeared under blankets of snow and fallen trees, created obstacles courses that would challenge even experienced outdoorsmen. The SEALs were the first to break camp, their military efficiency overcoming the stiffness and fatigue that came with the night of survival in sub-zero temperatures. Morrison conducted a quick head count and equipment check, then led his team toward the last known position of the other groups. They found the Green Berets emerging from their cave shelter, looking like refugees from a war zone. Rodriguez's team had survived the night, but they'd paid a price. 2 of his men were showing early signs of hypothermia, their coordination compromised, and their decision-making affected by the cold. "Any word on the civilian?" Rodriguez asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Morrison shook his head. "Nothing. We're going to have to search for her body on our way to the extraction point." The Delta Force operators appeared, An hour later, descending from their elevated position with the careful movements of men who'd been pushed to their limits. Brooks's gamble had paid off in terms of navigation. They knew exactly where they were and how to reach the extraction point, but the exposure had cost them dearly in terms of energy expenditure. "She's got to be dead," Brooks announced without preamble. No one survives a night like that without proper shelter and experience. Question is, do we spend time looking for her body, or do we focus on getting ourselves out of here alive? It was a harsh calculation, but it was the kind of decision that separated elite operators from regular soldiers. Resources were limited, time was precious, and the mission, getting to the extraction point, took precedence over sentiment. The combined group began moving toward the extraction coordinates, their progress slowed by the deep snow and the obstacles created by the storm. Every few hundred yards, they'd call out Sarah's name, listening for any response that might indicate she was still alive. The silence that answered them was more eloquent than any words. "This is what happens when civilians try to play soldier," muttered Cole, voicing what many of them were thinking. "She had no business being here. Kane should have never allowed it." "She signed the waivers," Morrison replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by his own words. "Adults are responsible for their own decisions." "Tell to her family," Rodriguez said quietly. They'd been moving for 3 hours when Jackson, who was on point, suddenly held up his hand for silence. The group froze, every sense alert for signs of danger. In survival situations, unusual sounds could mean anything from wildlife to the approach of rescue teams to the groans of trees about to fall. "Smoke," Jackson said, pointing toward a ridge about half a mile ahead. "Someone's got a fire going." The operators exchanged glances. There were only 3 possibilities: another training group, locals who'd been caught in the storm, or searchers looking for survivors. All 3 options were worth investigating. They approached the smoke source with tactical precision, using natural cover and maintaining fields of fire in case the situation turned hostile. What they found defied every expectation they'd harbored. Sarah Chen sat beside a carefully constructed fire, her back against a natural windbreak formed by fallen logs and strategically placed snow. She was not only alive, but appeared to be thriving. Her fire was burning with the steady heat of well-seasoned wood, and the smoke was rising in a straight column that suggested proper ventilation and wind management. More shocking still was what surrounded her makeshift camp. She'd constructed a debris shelter that would have impressed survival instructors, complete with insulation layers and water drainage. She'd fashioned tools from broken branches and stones, including what appeared to be a functional spear for fishing or hunting. And most impossible of all, she was cooking something that smelled like actual food. "Jesus Christ," whispered Peterson. "She's not just alive, she's comfortable." Morrison approached the camp with the caution of someone who'd seen too many. "Things that shouldn't be possible. Ms. Chen, are you all right?" Sarah looked up from her cooking with a slight smile. "Good morning, Lieutenant Commander. I was wondering when you'd find me." "Find you?" Brooks's voice carried a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Lady, we've been assuming you were dead for the past 12 hours. We've been planning a body recovery mission." "I'm sorry to disappoint you, Captain." Rodriguez stepped closer, his experienced eye cataloging the details of her camp. How is any of this possible? You said you had no survival training." Sarah's expression became thoughtful, as if she was considering how much to reveal. "I said I had no military training, Sergeant Major. I never said I had no survival experience." "What's the difference?" Morrison demanded. "The difference," Sarah said, stirring whatever she was cooking, "is that military survival training teaches you to endure until rescue arrives. Other kinds of survival training teach you to live indefinitely." The operator stared at her in stunned silence. Everything about her camp, from the fire construction to the shelter design to the tool fabrication, spoke of expertise that came from years of practical experience. This wasn't theoretical knowledge from books or weekend courses. This was the kind of skill that came from living it. "Other kinds of training?" Brooks repeated. "What other kinds?" Sarah's hand went unconsciously to her throat, where a small pendant hung beneath her shirt. It was a gesture so brief that most of them missed it. But Jackson, with his snipers' eye for detail, caught the movement. "You're not who you appear to be," Jackson said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone stating an observed fact rather than asking a question. Sarah met his gaze directly. "None of us are, petty officer. We're all more than we appear to be. The question is whether we're more or less than people assume." Rodriguez was still studying her camp, his mind racing through possibilities. This level of skill, it takes years to develop, decades even. You're not some amateur who got lucky. You're a professional. "I'm a survivor," Sarah replied simply. "That's not an answer," Morrison pressed. "Who trained you? Where did you learn these skills? And why are you pretending to be a civilian?" Sarah stood up, her movements graceful despite the harsh conditions. For the first time, the operators noticed details they'd missed before. The way she moved with economy of motion, wasting no energy on unnecessary gestures. The way her eyes constantly scanned the environment, cataloging threats and opportunities. The way she stood, balanced and ready, as if she was prepared for anything. "I learned these skills from someone who believed that survival wasn't about enduring hardship," she said. "It was about adapting to it, embracing it, making it work for you instead of against you." "That's still not an answer," Brooks said, his frustration evident. Sarah's expression softened slightly. "My grandfather was Inuit. He taught me that the land isn't your enemy, it's your partner. You don't fight winter, you dance with it. You don't conquer the wilderness, you join it." The explanation was both illuminating and insufficient. Indigenous survival skills could certainly account for her competence, but there was something else in her bearing, something that spoke of training, beyond traditional knowledge. "There's more," Jackson observed. "Inuit skills explain the fire, the shelter, the tools. They don't explain the tactical awareness, the way you move, the way you speak. You've had other training." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of old pain. "My grandfather taught me to survive in the wilderness. Someone else taught me to survive in the world." "Who?" Morrison asked gently, sensing that they were approaching something significant. "Someone who understood that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from the environment," Sarah replied. "It comes from the people who are supposed to protect you." The words hung in the air like a challenge, loaded with implications that none of them wanted to examine too closely. They were all warriors, protectors, guardians of the innocent. The suggestion that people like them could be the source of danger rather than the solution to it was uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate. "You're talking about abuse," Rodriguez said, his voice careful and controlled. "Someone hurt you, trained you to survive not just nature, but people." Sarah neither confirmed nor denied the assessment. Instead, she returned to her cooking, adding ingredients to her improvised meal with the practiced movements of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. "Would you like some food?" she asked, changing the subject with deliberate finality. "I caught some fish this morning, and I found some edible plants that survived the storm. You all look like you could use some calories." The operators exchanged glances, uncertain how to process what they'd learned. Sarah Chen wasn't just surviving the conditions that had pushed them to their limits. She was thriving in them. More than that, she was offering to share her success with them. The same. Men who dismissed her as a liability less than 24 hours ago. "Fish?" Cole asked, his skepticism evident. In this weather, the streams are frozen solid. Sarah pointed to a small hole in the ice near her camp, where an improvised fishing line disappeared into the dark water below. Moving water doesn't freeze as easily as still water. You just have to know where to look. Morrison approached the fishing hole, examining the setup with professional interest. The line was made from unraveled fabric, the hook fashioned from a bent piece of metal, the sinker created from a small stone. It was simple, functional, and effective, exactly the kind of improvised equipment that survival instructors taught, but few people ever mastered in practice. "This is impressive work," he admitted grudgingly. "But it still doesn't explain how you survived last night. The storm was Category 5. The wind chill was lethal." "I built a proper shelter," Sarah replied, gesturing to her debris hut. "Insulation, ventilation, heat retention, basic principles that work regardless of the weather." Brooks examined the shelter, his trained eye recognizing the sophisticated engineering hidden in what appeared to be a simple pile of branches and snow. "This isn't basic anything. This is advanced wilderness architecture. Where did you learn to build like this?" "Practice," Sarah said simply. "How much practice?" Rodriguez pressed. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "How long do you think it takes to get good at something when your life depends on it?" The question silenced them all. They were warriors who'd trained for years to develop their skills, but they'd always had the safety net of civilization to fall back on. Sarah was talking about something different, learning to survive not as a skill to be mastered, but as a daily necessity. "You lived in the wild," Jackson observed. "Not camping, not training exercises. You lived there." "For a while," Sarah confirmed. "How long is a while?" Morrison asked. Sarah's hand went to her throat again, touching the pendant beneath her shirt. "Long enough to learn that comfort is a choice, not a condition. Long enough to understand that the only person you can truly depend on is yourself." Her words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom, the kind of knowledge that came from experience rather than instruction. The operators found themselves looking at her with new eyes, seeing not the amateur civilian they'd dismissed, but a survivor whose skills had been forged in circumstances they could only imagine. "The extraction point is still 12 miles away," Rodriguez said, his tone suggesting he was beginning to see Sarah in a new light. "And we've got difficult terrain ahead. Rivers to cross, elevation changes, possibly more weather." "I know," Sarah replied. "I've been tracking our position since we started. We're actually slightly off course. The most direct route is northwest, not north." Morrison pulled out his map, comparing their current location to the extraction coordinates. After a moment of calculation, he looked up with surprise. "She's right. We've been following the valley floor because it seemed easier, but the direct route would save us almost 3 miles. "Direct route means climbing," Brooks pointed out. "Exposed ridges, dangerous footing, higher risk of exposure. Also means faster travel time and better navigation," Sarah countered. "The valleys are confusing, full of dead ends and false trails. The ridges provide clear sight lines and definitive direction." The debate that followed was revealing. The military operators were trained to minimize risk, to take the safer path, even if it meant longer travel times. Sarah advocated for the more direct approach, willing to accept short-term danger in exchange for long-term efficiency. "You're talking about risk management," Cole observed. "Military doctrine is about minimizing casualties, accepting longer mission times in exchange for safer outcomes." "I'm talking about survival doctrine," Sarah replied. "Sometimes the safest path is the one that gets you out of danger fastest." It was a philosophical difference that spoke to their different backgrounds and experiences. The military men had been trained to think in terms of units, teams, and acceptable losses. Sarah had been trained to think in terms of individual survival, where there was no backup and no second chances. As they prepared to move out, Sarah began breaking down her camp with the same efficiency she'd displayed in building it. Every piece of equipment was cleaned and stored, every trace of her presence was eliminated, and the fire was extinguished in a way that left no environmental impact. "Leave no trace," she explained, noticing their attention. "The wilderness teaches you, but you don't take from it without giving back. The combined group began moving toward the extraction point, with Sarah taking the lead despite the protests of the military men. Her navigation was flawless, her pace steady, and her route selection proved superior to their original plan. What should have been a grueling 12-mile slog became a manageable journey through terrain that seemed to accommodate their passage. "She's not just surviving," Morrison confided to his SEAL teammates as they followed her lead. "She's making it look easy." "That's what's bothering me," Jackson replied. "People don't develop this level of skill without a reason. She's been running from something, or preparing for something, or both." As they climbed toward the ridgeline, Sarah's expertise became even more apparent. She read the terrain like a book, identifying safe routes around obstacles, finding hidden paths that avoided the worst of the difficult going, and maintaining a pace that challenged even the fittest operators while never appearing to strain herself. "This is impossible," Cole muttered, struggling to keep up despite his years of conditioning. "She's half our size, she's carrying the same gear load, and she's outpacing everyone. How is she not exhausted?" Sarah overheard the comment and slowed her pace slightly. "Efficiency of movement," she explained. "When you're smaller, you learn to waste less energy. Every step has to count." "That's not just efficiency," Rodriguez observed. "That's biomechanics at a level that takes years to master. You move like a dancer or a martial artist." "I've studied movement," Sarah acknowledged. "When your survival depends on your physical capabilities, you learn to use your body as efficiently as possible." The conversation was interrupted by a new challenge. They'd reached a section of the ridge where the storm had created a massive snowdrift that blocked their path. The drift was too deep to wade through, too unstable to climb over, and too long to go around without adding miles to their journey. The operators gathered around the obstacle, discussing options and calculating risks. The debate quickly became heated as different tactical approaches were proposed and rejected. "We backtrack to the valley floor," Morrison argued. "It's safer, even if it takes longer." "That adds 4 hours to our travel time," Brooks countered. "We don't have the energy reserves for that kind of detour." "Better tired than dead," Rodriguez pointed out. "This drift could give way and bury us." While they argued, Sarah had been examining the obstacle from different angles, her movement systematic and purposeful. She probed the snow with her improvised spear, tested the stability of the underlying ground, and studied the wind patterns that had created the formation. "It's not as deep as it looks," she announced, interrupting their debate. "The wind created a false surface. Underneath, there's only about 3 feet of snow over solid ground." "How can you tell?" Brooks asked skeptically. Sarah demonstrated by pushing her spear through the snowdrift, revealing that it penetrated much deeper than the apparent surface suggested. "The top layer is wind-packed powder, but the bottom is compacted snow over frozen earth. We can tunnel through." "Tunnel?" Cole's voice carried disbelief. "Through a snowdrift? That's insane." "That's expedient," Sarah corrected. "Tunneling requires less energy than climbing or detouring, and it's actually safer than it appears. Snow is an excellent insulator, and the tunnel will be protected from wind." The military men exchanged glances, their training warring with their growing respect for Sarah's expertise. Everything she'd suggested so far had proven correct, but tunneling through a snowdrift seemed to cross the line from competent to reckless. "I'll go first," Sarah said, settling the debate. "If it's unsafe, I'll back out and we'll try a different approach." Before anyone could protest, she began excavating an opening in the drift, her movements efficient and confident. Within minutes, she'd created a tunnel entrance that was both structurally sound and large enough for a person to crawl through. "This is crazy," Morrison muttered, but he was already removing his pack to follow her lead. One by one, the operators crawled through Sarah's tunnel, emerging on the other side with a new appreciation for both her ingenuity and her courage. The tunnel had been perfectly engineered, stable, safe, and efficient. What should have been a major obstacle had been reduced to a minor inconvenience through superior problem solving. "Where did you learn to do that?" Rodriguez asked as they resumed their march. "Trial and error," Sarah replied. "When you're alone in the wilderness, you get creative or you die." The simple statement carried implications that sobered all of them. They were beginning to understand that Sarah's skills hadn't been learned in classrooms or training exercises, but in situations where failure meant death. Her competence wasn't theoretical, it was survival-tested and life-proven. As they crested the ridge, the extraction point came into view below them, a flat area suitable for helicopter landing, marked by GPS coordinates and surrounded by terrain that would allow for safe approach and departure. They were less than 2 miles away from mission completion. "We're going to make it," Cole said, his relief evident. "We were always going to make it," Sarah replied quietly. "The question was whether we'd make it together." Her words hung in the air as they began their descent toward the extraction point. The military operators found themselves processing not just the physical challenges they'd overcome, but the assumptions they'd made and the lessons they'd learned about judging people by appearances. Sarah Chen had done more than survive the Kodiak Survival Institute's most challenging exercise. She'd excelled at it while simultaneously challenging everything the elite operators thought they knew about survival, competence, and strength. And as they approached the end of their journey, they realized that the most important question wasn't how she'd developed her skills, but why she'd chosen to share them with men who dismissed her as a liability. The answer to that question would prove to be more revealing than any of them were prepared to handle. The extraction point buzzed with activity as the combined group of operators descended from the ridge. Support personnel were already on site, having arrived by helicopter an hour earlier to coordinate the pickup. Medical technicians, debriefing officers, and logistics specialists moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for the return of what they'd assumed would be a significantly reduced number of survivors. The extraction point buzzed with activity as the combined group of operators descended from the ridge. Support personnel were already on site, having arrived by helicopter an hour earlier to coordinate the pickup. Medical technicians, debriefing, officers and logistics specialists moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for the return of what they'd assumed would be a significantly reduced number of survivors. Chief Instructor Kane stood near the landing zone, his weathered face showing the strain of the past 3 days. In his 15 years of running Kodiak Survival Institute, he'd overseen dozens of exercises, but none had weighed on him quite like this one. The decision to allow Sarah Chen into the program had been controversial from the beginning, and her apparent death during the storm would mean investigations, inquiries, and questions he wasn't sure he could answer. The sight of the full group emerging from the wilderness intact stopped him cold. Kane counted heads twice, unable to believe what his eyes were telling him. Not only had everyone survived, but they appeared to be in better condition than he'd expected after 3 days in some of the worst weather Alaska had thrown at them in years. "That's impossible," muttered Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the program's chief medical officer. She'd been prepared for hypothermia cases, frostbite treatments, and possible evacuations. Instead, she was looking at a group of elite warriors who seemed energized rather than depleted by their ordeal. Kane's eyes found Sarah Chen in the group, walking with the same quiet confidence she'd displayed at the beginning of the exercise. She wasn't just alive, she appeared to be thriving. Her gear was organized, her movements were controlled, and she showed none of the signs of exposure and exhaustion that marked the other survivors. Somebody want to explain to me how the civilian not only survived, but appears to be in better shape than my Navy SEALs? Kane's voice carried across the landing zone, drawing the attention of every support person present. Lieutenant Commander Morrison stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Chief, we need to talk. Privately." Kane studied Morrison's face, reading the subtle signs that indicated this conversation would be significant. "Dr. Harper, get everyone checked out. I want full medical evaluations before anyone leaves this site." He turned to Morrison. "My tent, 5 minutes." As the medical team began their examinations, the operators found themselves the subject of intense scrutiny from the support staff. Word had already spread through the base about the impossible civilian who'd volunteered for the program, and her survival had become the stuff of legend before she'd even returned. "Is it true she had no military training?" asked Sergeant Williams, one of the logistics coordinators. "True," Rodriguez confirmed, submitting to Dr. Harper's examination with practiced patience. "Then how did she not only survive, but apparently lead you guys to safety?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications that none of the operators were quite ready to address. They'd spent 3 days watching their assumptions about survival, competence, and leadership systematically dismantled by a woman they dismissed as a liability. Dr. Harper's examination of Sarah proved particularly revealing. Blood pressure normal, heart rate steady, no signs of dehydration or hypothermia, she announced, her voice carrying professional bewilderment. "Ms. Chen, have you been eating and staying hydrated during the exercise?" "Yes, doctor," Sarah replied simply. "May I ask how?" The rations provided were minimal, and finding clean water in these conditions requires significant expertise. "I found food and purified water from natural sources." Dr. Harper made notes on her clipboard, her confusion evident. "Ms. Chen, I've been the medical officer for this program for 8 years. I've treated Navy SEALs who've lost 15 pounds during 3-day exercises. You appear to have actually gained weight." The observation drew stares from the other survivors. Weight loss during survival exercises was inevitable. The human body burned calories faster than they could be replaced, leading to rapid depletion of energy reserves. For Sarah to have maintained or even increased her body weight suggested a level of resource acquisition that bordered on the impossible. "I had good hunting and gathering," Sarah explained, her tone suggesting the accomplishment was unremarkable. "Hunting?" Brooks interjected from across the medical station. "With what? We were given one knife and basic survival gear. There are no hunting weapons, no fishing equipment, no traps." "I improvised," Sarah replied. The simple statement carried weight that silenced the medical station. Improvising hunting equipment in Arctic conditions wasn't just difficult, it was the kind of advanced survival skill that took years to master. The fact that Sarah had not only created functional hunting tools, but had used them successfully enough to maintain her nutrition spoke to expertise that went far beyond anything they'd witnessed. In Kane's tent, Morrison was struggling to find words for what he'd experienced. "Chief, I've been in special operations for 12 years. I've worked with the best operators in the world. What I saw out there..." He paused, searching for the right description. "She didn't just survive, she made survival look effortless." Kane leaned back in his chair, his expression skeptical. "Effortless? Morrison, we're talking about conditions that would challenge a polar bear. Nobody makes that look effortless." "She did." Morrison's voice carried absolute certainty. Chief, she built a shelter that was better than anything we managed. She maintained a fire through winds that were putting out our attempts. She found food sources we didn't even know existed. And when we were lost and exhausted, she navigated us directly to the extraction point using terrain features we couldn't even see. Kane was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. You're telling me that a civilian with no military training outperformed a combined team of Navy SEALs, Green Berets, and Delta Force operators in survival conditions? I'm telling you she didn't just outperform us, Morrison replied. She carried us. Without her navigation, her resource acquisition, and her tactical decisions, we might not have made it. The statement hung between them like an accusation. Kane had built his reputation on the premise that military training created the ultimate survivors, that discipline and conditioning were the keys to enduring extreme conditions. The suggestion that a civilian could not only match, but exceed. That performance challenged everything he believed about his program. There's something else, Morrison continued. Her skills aren't amateur or improvised. She moves like someone with deep training, thinks like someone with extensive experience, and problem solves like someone who's been doing this for decades. She's not who she appears to be. Kane's expression hardened. Meaning what exactly? Meaning she has a background she's not sharing. The level of competence we witnessed doesn't develop in a vacuum. Someone trained her and they trained her well. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the tent flap. "Come!" Kane called out. Captain Brooks entered, his expression grim. "Chief, we have a problem." Kane gestured for him to continue. "I've been talking with the other operators, comparing notes about what we observed. Ms. Chen's skills aren't just impressive, they're professionally implemented. Her fire construction uses techniques I've only seen in specialized military survival schools. Her shelter design incorporates engineering principles from Arctic warfare training. Her navigation methods are straight out of special reconnaissance doctrine." Morrison nodded in agreement. "That's what I've been trying to tell the chief. She's not an amateur who got lucky. She's a professional operating at a level that exceeds most of our capabilities." Kane stood up, his mind racing through possibilities. "You think she's military, deep cover, classified background, something like that?" "I think she's something," Brooks replied. "The question is what and why she's pretending to be a civilian." Nice, the implications were troubling. If Sarah Chen was operating under false pretenses, if she had military training she was concealing, then her presence in the program raised questions about security, objectives, and agenda that Kane wasn't equipped to answer. "Bring her in," Kane decided. "Time for some straight answers." While Kane prepared for his confrontation with Sarah, the debriefing process continued outside. The operators found themselves surrounded by support personnel hungry for details about the legendary civilian who'd survived the impossible. Each retelling of the story seemed to add new elements, new impossibilities that stretched credibility even further. "She caught fish through 6 inches of ice," Petty Officer Jackson was explaining to a fascinated audience. "Not one fish, multiple fish, enough to feed the entire group when we found her." "How?" asked Master Sergeant Tyler, a survival instructor who'd spent years teaching the very skills Jackson was describing. "Improvised equipment," Jackson replied. "Line made from unraveled fabric, hooks fashioned from bent metal, weights created from stones." But it wasn't just the equipment, it was the technique. She knew exactly where to fish, how to read the water, how to work the ice. Professional-level competence. Tyler shook his head in disbelief. "Ice fishing in those conditions requires years of experience. You don't just figure it out through trial and error." "That's what we keep coming back to," Rodriguez added, joining the conversation. "Every skill she demonstrated was at a professional level. fire management, shelter construction, navigation, resource acquisition, even weather prediction. She called the storm patterns 12 hours before our meteorological equipment confirmed them. The gathering crowd of support personnel listened with growing amazement as the operators recounted detail after detail of Sarah's performance. Each story seemed to reveal new layers of competence that defied explanation. "Maybe she's some kind of savant," suggested Lieutenant Palmer, one of the program's administrative officers. "You know, naturally gifted at survival skills." "Savants don't develop tactical awareness," Cole interjected. "This woman moved through the terrain like someone with military reconnaissance training. She read the environment for threats, identified defensive positions, and maintained situational awareness at a level that would impress special operations veterans." The crowd fell silent as the implications sank in. They were talking about someone whose skills crossed multiple disciplines, whose competence spanned areas that typically required separate and extensive training programs. The picture that emerged was of someone whose background was far more complex than she'd admitted. Sarah herself remained quietly focused during her medical examination, answering Dr. Harper's questions with minimal detail while observing the increasing attention her survival had generated. She could hear fragments of the conversations around her, could sense the growing curiosity and suspicion about her capabilities. "Ms. Chen," Dr. Harper said, completing her examination, "I have to ask, have you been completely honest about your background? The level of physical conditioning you've demonstrated, the apparent familiarity with extreme conditions, the complete absence of stress indicators. These aren't consistent with someone experiencing their first survival situation." Sarah met the doctor's gaze directly. "Doctor, I've been honest about what you've asked me. That's not quite the same thing as being completely honest, is it?" Before Sarah could respond, Kane's voice boomed across the medical station. "Ms. Chen, I need to see you in my tent, now." The command carried the weight of military authority, and every conversation in the area stopped as Sarah rose to follow Kane. The operators watched her go with expressions of concern and curiosity, aware that the confrontation they'd all been anticipating was about to take place. Kane's tent felt smaller with Sarah inside it, her presence somehow filling the space despite her slight frame. Morrison and Brooks flanked Kane's desk like guards, their expressions serious and professional. "Sit down, Ms. Chen," Kane instructed, his voice carrying the tone he used for disciplinary actions. Sarah remained standing. "I'm comfortable, Chief." I said, "Sit down." Yes, Kane's voice carried the edge of command authority, the kind of tone that had compelled obedience from thousands of soldiers over his career. Sarah's response was to stand slightly straighter, her posture shifting almost imperceptibly into something that radiated quiet resistance. And I said, "I'm comfortable." The moment stretched between them, a test of wills that revealed more about both participants than either intended. Kane was accustomed to absolute authority in his domain, to trainees who jumped when he spoke and never questioned his instructions. Sarah's polite but firm refusal to comply represented a challenge to that authority that he wasn't equipped to handle. "Ms. Chen," Morrison interjected, his tone diplomatic, "we have some questions about your performance during the exercise." "I'm listening," Sarah replied, her attention shifting to Morrison while maintaining her defensive posture. Brooks stepped forward, his approach more direct. "Your survival skills are professional level. Your tactical awareness is military grade. Your physical conditioning exceeds that of most special operations personnel. You want to explain how a civilian develops those capabilities?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her response. "I've had good teachers." "What teachers?" Kane demanded. "Where? When?" "We've done background checks, Ms. Chen. According to every record we can find, you're a medical technician from Seattle with no relevant experience. Records don't always. Tell the complete story, Chief. Kane's frustration was becoming evident. Then you tell the complete story, right now. No more evasions, no more half-answers. Who are you and what are you really doing in my program? Sarah's expression softened. Slightly, but her posture remained defensive. I'm exactly who I said I am, Chief. A medical technician who wanted to test herself against your survival course. Bullshit, Brooks interjected. Medical technicians don't develop special operations level survival skills. They don't move like reconnaissance specialists. They don't think like strategic planners. You've got military training and you're lying about it. I've never served in the military, Sarah replied, her voice calm despite the accusatory tone. Then where did you learn to fight? Morrison asked quietly. The question hit like a physical blow, causing Sarah to take an involuntary step backward. For the first time since they'd met her, she appeared vulnerable, caught off guard by the directness of the question. Fight, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. You move like someone who's been in combat, Morrison continued, his tone gentle but persistent. Not training, not exercises, real combat. Your situational awareness, your threat assessment, your defensive positioning. Those are combat-tested skills. Sarah's hand went to her throat, touching the pendant, beneath her shirt in a gesture they'd seen before. The movement was unconscious, protective, and revealing in its vulnerability. I've never been in combat, she said, but her voice lacked the conviction of her earlier denials. Kane leaned forward, sensing weakness. But you've been in situations where you needed combat skills, haven't you, Ms. Chen? The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stood motionless, her hand still at her throat, her eyes distant as if she was seeing something far removed from the tent around her. Ms. Chen? Morrison prompted gently. Sarah's focus returned to the present, and for a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked. They caught a glimpse of something deeper, pain, loss, and a kind of weariness that came from carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. Sometimes, she said quietly, the most dangerous combat isn't against enemy soldiers. The words hung in the air like a confession, loaded with implications that made all three men uncomfortable. They were warriors, trained to fight external enemies, to protect the innocent from foreign threats. The suggestion that combat could be something else, something more personal and more devastating, challenged their understanding of what they were fighting for. What does that mean? Kane asked, his voice losing some of its authority. Sarah looked directly at him, her dark eyes carrying depths they hadn't seen before. It means, Chief, that some of us learn to survive not because we want to, but because we have to. Brooks stepped closer, his expression shifting from suspicion to concern. Ms. Chen, are you talking about domestic violence? Abuse? Sarah neither confirmed nor denied the question, but her silence was more eloquent than any words could have been. Morrison felt a weight settling in his chest as understanding began to dawn. The survival skills, the tactical awareness, the combat readiness, you developed them to protect yourself. I developed them to stay alive, Sarah corrected quietly. The simple statement reframed everything they thought they knew about her. The professional-level competence, the deep training, the years of practice, all of it took on new meaning. When viewed through the lens of someone who'd learned survival skills not for adventure or career advancement, but for literal survival. Kane found himself reassessing every assumption he'd made. How long? He asked, his voice stripped of its earlier authority. How long what, Chief? How long were you in danger? How long did you have to live like that? Sarah's smile was sad and distant. Long enough to get very good at staying alive. The tent fell silent as the three military men processed what they'd learned. They were warriors who'd volunteered for danger, who'd chosen combat as a profession, who'd trained for years to develop the skills necessary to survive in hostile environments. Sarah had developed those same skills and more as a necessity for surviving her daily life. The wilderness training, Morrison said, understanding finally clicking into place. You weren't learning to survive in nature, you were learning to disappear into it. My grandfather taught me that the wilderness could be a sanctuary, Sarah confirmed, that if you knew how to live with it instead of fighting it, it would protect you from things that civilization couldn't. Things like abusive partners, Brooks said, his voice carefully controlled. Things like people who thought they owned me, Sarah replied, her tone carrying steel beneath the quiet words. Kane stood up, his entire demeanor changing as he processed the revelation. Ms. Chen, I owe you an apology. We all do. We made assumptions about your motivations, your capabilities, your reasons for being here. You don't owe me anything. Chief, you did your job as you understood it. No, Kane said firmly. We failed to understand that courage comes in different forms, that survival skills can be developed under circumstances we never considered, that sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones who never wanted to fight at all. The admission hung between them, a recognition that their military perspective had blinded them to other forms of strength and competence. They'd assumed that effective survival skills could only come from institutional training, that tactical awareness was exclusively a product of military education, that real competence required formal credentials. Sarah had proven them wrong on every count. There's something else, Morrison said, his voice thoughtful. The way you've been helping us, sharing your skills, taking care of the group, that's not survival behavior, that's service behavior. Sarah's expression became contemplative. Maybe they're the same thing, Lieutenant Commander. Maybe survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about staying human while you do it. Brooks shook his head in amazement. You could have left us to struggle. Could have focused purely on your own survival and reached the extraction point days ahead of us. Instead, you made sure we all made it out together. Why? Kane asked simply. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Because, she said simply, I know what it's like to be abandoned when you need help most. I know what it's like to face impossible circumstances alone. And I know that sometimes the only way to heal from that is to make sure nobody else has, to experience it. The words hit each man differently, but they all felt the impact. Morrison thought of teammates he'd lost, wondering if better support might have saved them. Brooks considered the isolation of special operations work, the way warriors were trained to be self-sufficient to the point of loneliness. Kane reflected on the trainees he'd pushed to their limits, sometimes past their limits, in the name of building strength. Ms. Chen, Kane said finally, I think we've been asking the wrong questions. What questions should you be asking, Chief? Kane looked at Morrison and Brooks, then back at Sarah. Not who trained you, or where you learned your skills, or why you're here. The question we should be asking is what we can learn from you. Sarah's expression softened, and for the first time since they'd met her, she seemed to relax slightly. That's a different conversation entirely, Chief. I'd like to have that conversation, Morrison said. All of us would. Brooks nodded in agreement. Your methods, your approach to survival, your problem-solving techniques, they're different from what we've been taught. More effective in some ways, more sustainable. Military survival training is designed for short-term endurance, Sarah observed. Get through the crisis, reach the extraction point, return to base. My training was designed for indefinite self-sufficiency, different goals, different methods. Kane sat back down, his posture now that of a student rather than an interrogator. Would you be willing to share some of those methods, formally I mean, as part of our curriculum? Sarah looked surprised by the request. You want me to teach survival skills to Navy SEALs and Special Forces operators? I want you to teach survival skills to anyone who might need them, Kane replied. Military personnel, civilian contractors, search and rescue teams, humanitarian workers. Your approach could save lives. The offer hung in the air, representing a complete reversal of the dynamic that had brought them together. Instead of Sarah proving herself worthy of their program, they were asking her to improve their program with her expertise. I'd need to think about that, Sarah said carefully. Of course, Kane replied, but while you're thinking, maybe you could answer one more question. What's that, Chief? Kane's expression became serious again. Are you safe now? The situation that drove you to develop these skills, is it resolved? Sarah's hand went to her throat again, touching the pendant with unconscious protectiveness. It's been resolved for several years, Chief, but the skills remain useful. Good, Kane said simply, because I have a feeling we're going to learn a lot from each other. As Sarah left Kane's tent, word of the conversation had already begun to spread through the extraction site. The operators who'd witnessed her performance were sharing details with the support personnel, and the story was growing with each telling. But now, the story had context, background and meaning that transformed it from an impressive demonstration of survival skills into something much more significant. Rodriguez found Morrison by the landing zone, watching the helicopter preparations. Sir, what's the word on our civilian? Morrison looked thoughtful. She's not just a civilian, Sergeant Major. She's a survivor in ways we're just beginning to understand. Meaning? Meaning we've been asking the wrong questions and making the wrong assumptions. Sarah Chen didn't come here to prove she could survive our training. She came here because she'd already survived things that would break most of us. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. The skills she demonstrated, the competence level, that wasn't learned in weekend courses. No, Morrison agreed. That was learned in circumstances none of us want to imagine. And the fact that she's maintained her humanity, her willingness to help others, her capacity for service that makes her stronger than any of us. As the helicopter rotors began to spin up for departure, the combined group of operators prepared to return to their regular duties. But they carried with them a new understanding of strength, survival, and service that would influence their approach to training, leadership, and life. Sarah Chen had come to Kodiak Survival Institute as an unknown quantity, a civilian whose presence had been questioned and whose capabilities had been dismissed. She was leaving as someone who'd fundamentally changed how the military's elite viewed survival, competence, and the sources of real strength. The woman they'd laughed at had taught them lessons they'd never forget, and in doing so, she'd proven that sometimes the greatest teachers are the ones who never intended to teach at all, who simply lived their truth with such authenticity that others couldn't help but learn from it. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying them back to civilization, each man found himself wondering what other assumptions they'd made, what other strengths they'd failed to recognize, and what other lessons waited to be learned from the most unlikely sources. Sarah Chen gazed out the window at the Alaskan wilderness below, the terrain that had tested them all and found some wanting while revealing others to be far more than they appeared. She'd come seeking to test herself against the military's standards. Instead, she discovered that her own standards were something entirely different and perhaps more valuable than anything the military could teach. The question now was what she would do with that knowledge, and how many other people might benefit from the lessons she'd learned in the crucible of survival that had forged her into someone stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined possible. 6 months later, Sarah Chen stood before a packed auditorium at the National Defense University, her weathered hands steady as she addressed an audience of military instructors, special operations commanders, and survival training specialists from across the globe. The woman who had once been dismissed as an unqualified civilian now commanded the attention of the world's most elite warriors, her insights reshaping how entire branches of the military approached survival education. Traditional military survival. Training operates on the assumption that rescue is coming, Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the lecture hall. Every technique, every strategy, every decision is made with the understanding that you need to endure until extraction arrives. But what happens when rescue isn't coming? What happens when you're not surviving temporarily, but permanently? And the question resonated through the audience, challenging fundamental assumptions that had guided military doctrine for decades. In the front row, Chief Instructor Kane took notes with the attention of a student rather than a peer, his understanding of survival completely transformed by the past 6 months of working with Sarah. Her integration into the Kodiak program had been nothing short of revolutionary. What had begun as an offer to share her techniques had evolved into a complete restructuring of how the Institute approached survival training. Sarah's methods didn't just prepare trainees to endure hardship, they taught them to thrive in it, to find sustainable solutions that could work indefinitely rather than temporary fixes that lasted until rescue. Lieutenant Commander Morrison, now serving as liaison between Sarah's program and SEAL team training, had witnessed the transformation firsthand. The survival rates in extreme conditions had improved dramatically, but more importantly, the psychological resilience of trainees had increased exponentially. Sarah's approach didn't just build physical survival skills, it developed mental and emotional strategies that helped warriors maintain their humanity under the worst possible circumstances. The difference, Sarah continued, between surviving and living is often a matter of mindset. Military training focuses on mission completion, on pushing through adversity to reach an objective. Sustainable survival requires a different approach entirely. It requires learning to find peace within adversity, to make hardship your ally rather than your enemy. In the audience, Dr. Harper furiously scribbled notes, her medical training helping her understand the psychological principles underlying Sarah's methods. The traditional approach to survival training was essentially controlled trauma, push people beyond their limits to build resilience. Sarah's approach was more sophisticated, using environmental challenges as opportunities for growth and self-discovery rather than ordeals to be endured. The transformation in the trainees who went through Sarah's modified program was remarkable. They returned from exercises not depleted and traumatized, but energized and confident. They'd learned to see wilderness not as an enemy to be fought, but as a complex system to be understood and worked with. The skills they developed were transferable to other aspects of military service, improving their performance in everything from combat operations to leadership development. Captain Brooks, now co-director of the Enhanced Survival Program, had become one of Sarah's most effective advocates within the special operations community. His own understanding of leadership had been fundamentally altered by watching Sarah guide groups through impossible challenges without relying on traditional command authority. Her leadership style was based on competence, service, and genuine care for the people under her guidance, rather than rank, intimidation, or institutional power. The question we must ask ourselves, Sarah said, advancing to her next slide, is whether we're training warriors to survive or training survivors to be warriors. The distinction matters more than you might think. The slide showed comparative data from survival exercises conducted before and after implementing Sarah's methods. The numbers were striking, not just improved completion rates and reduced medical incidents, but measurable improvements in teamwork, problem-solving, and long-term psychological health among participants. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, now serving as Sarah's assistant instructor, had seen the changes firsthand. The soldiers who emerged from the enhanced program weren't just better at surviving in wilderness conditions, they were better at surviving the psychological challenges of military service, better at maintaining their mental health under stress, and better at supporting their teammates through difficult circumstances. Sarah's background had eventually become known throughout the military community, though she'd never officially disclosed the details of her past. The knowledge that her expertise had been forged in the crucible of domestic violence had added weight to her teachings, lending authenticity to her insights about resilience, adaptation, and finding strength in impossible circumstances. The pendant she wore had become something of a legend among her students. Made from a piece of metal taken from the car that had carried her away from her abusive situation for the final time, it represented not just survival, but transformation. Sarah had shared its significance during one particularly intense training session, explaining how symbols of past trauma could be transformed into sources of current strength. Survival, she had told her students that day, isn't about forgetting the things that hurt you. It's about transforming them into the things that make you stronger. The lesson had resonated throughout the military training community, influencing approaches to everything from PTSD treatment to combat stress management. Sarah's perspective on trauma as a potential source of strength, rather than just damage, had opened new avenues for helping warriors process their experiences and maintain their effectiveness over long careers. As her lecture continued, Sarah moved into the practical applications of her theories. The audience watched video footage from recent training exercises, seeing groups of elite operators working together with unprecedented cooperation and efficiency. The traditional competitive dynamics that often emerged under stress had been replaced by collaborative approaches that leveraged each individual's strengths while compensating for their weaknesses. Competition has its place in military training, Sarah explained, but survival is fundamentally cooperative. The environment provides enough challenges without creating artificial adversity between team members. When you teach people to see each other as resources rather than rivals, their collective capability increases exponentially. The footage showed Sarah working with a mixed group of special operations personnel, her small frame dwarfed by the elite warriors around her, but her authority unmistakable as she guided them through complex survival scenarios. What struck observers was not just her technical competence, but the genuine respect and trust she commanded from people who were trained to be skeptical of anyone who hadn't earned their credentials through traditional military channels. Petty Officer Jackson, now serving as a survival instructor himself, had become one of Sarah's most effective advocates for her methods. His sniper training had taught him to observe details others missed, and he'd been among the first to recognize that Sarah's approach to survival was fundamentally different from anything the military had previously developed. She doesn't teach survival techniques, Jackson had explained to colleagues who questioned the program. She teaches survival philosophy. The techniques are just applications of deeper principles about adaptation, resilience, and sustainable performance under stress. Those principles had applications far beyond wilderness survival. Military units that had been exposed to Sarah's training showed improved performance in urban environments, combat situations, and peacekeeping missions. The psychological tools she taught, finding calm within chaos, making adversity work for you rather than against you, maintaining long-term perspective during short-term crises, proved invaluable across the entire spectrum of military operations. As Sarah's presentation moved toward its conclusion, she addressed the question that had driven her own journey from victim to survivor to teacher. The most important lesson I can share with you is this: strength isn't about avoiding difficulty or powering through it. Real strength is about learning to dance with difficulty, to find grace within hardship, to discover that the things that test us most severely often teach us most profoundly. The auditorium was silent as her words sank in. These were people who had dedicated their lives to building and measuring strength, who had spent careers developing and implementing training programs designed to create warriors capable of surviving anything the world could throw at them. Sarah was suggesting that they had been approaching the problem from the wrong direction entirely. Military training traditionally works by controlled application of stress, she continued. Push people past their comfort zones, challenge their assumptions, force them to adapt under pressure. But there's a difference between stress that builds and stress that breaks. The key is learning to recognize the difference and adjust accordingly. The distinction had profound implications for how military training was conducted at every level. Sarah's methods didn't eliminate stress or challenge. They changed how people related to stress and challenge, helping them see difficult circumstances as opportunities for growth rather than obstacles to be overcome. Chief Kane, reflecting on his own transformation over the past 6 months, understood that Sarah had done more than improve his training program. She had fundamentally altered his understanding of what it meant to be strong, what it meant to lead, and what it meant to serve. The authoritarian approach that had defined his career had been replaced by something more sophisticated: leadership through competence, influence through service, authority through authenticity. As the presentation ended and the audience erupted in sustained applause, Sarah stood quietly at the podium, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. She had never sought recognition or authority, had never intended to become a teacher or leader. But circumstances had thrust her into a position where her hard-won wisdom could benefit others, and she had accepted that responsibility with the same quiet determination that had characterized every aspect of her survival journey. During the reception that followed, Sarah found herself surrounded by military personnel eager to learn more about her methods and philosophy. The conversations ranged from technical discussions about specific survival techniques to deeper explorations of leadership, resilience, and the psychological aspects of high-performance training. Lieutenant Commander Morrison approached her near the end of the event, his expression serious. "Sarah, I've got a question that's been bothering me for months." "What's that, Jake? Why did you really come to Kodiak?" "You had to know you were walking into a situation where you'd be questioned, challenged, possibly humiliated. You had to know the risks. So why take them?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. "Because," she said finally, "I needed to know if the strength I'd built for myself could be useful for others. I needed to know if the lessons I'd learned in the darkness could bring light to other people's struggles." Morrison nodded slowly, understanding finally clicking into place. "You weren't testing yourself against our standards. You were testing our standards against your experience." "Something like that," Sarah agreed, and finding out that both could be improved in the process. As the evening wound down, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. The terrified woman who had fled into the Alaskan wilderness years earlier had been seeking only safety, only survival. She had never imagined that her desperate search for sanctuary would eventually lead her to become a source of strength and wisdom for others. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. There had been years of struggle, of learning to trust herself and others, of gradually building the confidence to share her hard-won knowledge. But each step had led logically to the next. Each challenge had provided preparation for the next level of growth and service. Standing in the reception area, surrounded by some of the military's most elite personnel seeking her advice and insight, Sarah understood that her greatest victory hadn't been surviving the wilderness or outlasting the Navy SEALs, or even transforming military training doctrine. Her greatest victory had been maintaining her humanity throughout the process, refusing to let hardship make her harder, choosing service over bitterness, even when she had every reason to choose otherwise. The woman who had once been laughed at in survival school had become someone whose laughter now brought joy to others, whose strength lifted up everyone around her, and whose wisdom helped transform how an entire institution understood the nature of survival itself. In the end, Sarah Chen had proven that the most profound victories aren't won against external enemies, but against the internal forces that would make us less than we're capable of being. She had shown that true strength isn't about dominating others, but about lifting them up. And she had demonstrated that sometimes the greatest teachers are those who never intended to teach, but simply lived their truth with such authenticity that others couldn't help but learn from their example. As she finally headed home that evening, Sarah reflected on how far she'd traveled from the broken woman who had first sought refuge in the wilderness. The journey from victim to survivor, to teacher to leader, had been longer and more complex than anything she could have imagined. But every step had been necessary. Every challenge had provided essential preparation for the role she now filled. The pendant at her throat caught the light as she walked. The metal that had once represented trauma now transformed into a symbol of triumph. Like Sarah herself, it had been changed by fire into something stronger, more beautiful, and infinitely more valuable than its original form. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new opportunities to share the lessons that had been forged in the crucible of her experience. But tonight, Sarah Chen could rest in the knowledge that her survival had become something greater. Than mere endurance, it had become a source of hope and strength for countless others who were fighting their own battles against impossible odds. The simple woman who had been laughed at survival school had proven that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from weapons or training or institutional authority, but from the quiet determination to remain human in circumstances that would make it easier to become something less. In doing so, she had taught everyone around her that true victory isn't about defeating others. It's about becoming the best version of yourself, regardless of the circumstances that shaped you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.